The fork trembled in Vincent Marcello's hand as he watched the man in the charcoal suit walk through his restaurant's front door. It was 7:47 p.m. on a Tuesday evening in October 1956. Marcello's Italian kitchen on 25th Street and Lenox Avenue was packed with the dinner crowd. The smell of garlic and basil thick in the air, the sound of conversation and clinking glasses filling every corner. But the moment Bumpy Johnson stepped inside, something changed in the atmosphere. Not silence, nothing that dramatic, just a subtle shift, like the air before a thunderstorm. Marcello had been expecting this visit for exactly 24 hours. Ever since yesterday when he'd made what he thought was a simple business decision, a decision that would teach him something about power that no business school could have prepared him for. But to understand why Vincent Marcello was about to experience the longest night of his life, you need to understand what Harlem looked like in 1956. This wasn't just a neighborhood, this was an ecosystem, a delicate balance of relationships, respect and unspoken agreements that kept everything functioning. At the center of that ecosystem was a man who didn't carry a badge, didn't hold elected office, but whose word carried more weight than both. Bumpy Johnson in 1956 was 51 years old. Silver threading through his hair, lines around his eyes, that spoke of decisions most men would never have to make. He dressed like a Wall Street executive, spoke like a college professor, and commanded respect in a way that couldn't be taught or bought. For over 2 decades he'd been the unofficial mayor of Harlem, the man who settled disputes, protected businesses, and ensured that his neighborhood remained his neighborhood. Vincent Marcello had moved to Harlem 6 months earlier with dreams and a small inheritance. He'd bought a struggling restaurant on one of Harlem's busiest corners, renovated it with his life savings, and opened Marcello's Italian kitchen, with hopes of serving the growing middle class of the Rari. Good food, fair prices, honest business. What could go wrong? What Marcello didn't understand was that in Harlem, every business was part of a larger conversation. Every restaurant, every shop, every corner store existed within a network of relationships that had been built over decades. You didn't just serve food, you served the community, and the community had rules. Monday evening, October 15, 1956. Bumpy Johnson walked into Marcello's Italian kitchen for the first time. He was alone, which was unusual. Normally he traveled with associates, but tonight he was simply a man looking for dinner. He wore his typical understated elegance, a navy blue suit, white shirt, conservative tie. He looked like any other businessman ending his day with a meal. Marcello watched him enter from behind the cash register. He'd heard stories, of course. Every business owner in Harlem had heard stories about Bumpy Johnson. Some called him a protector, others called him something else entirely. But Marcello was from Little Italy, in Lower Manhattan. He'd grown up around different rules, different power structure. He thought he understood how the world worked. Bumpy approached the hostess station, where Maria, Marcello's wife, greeted customers. She smiled warmly, reached for a menu, began to escort him toward a table near the window. That's when Marcello made his decision. "Maria," he called out, his voice carrying across the restaurant, "we're full." The restaurant wasn't full. Empty tables sat throughout the dining room. The lie was obvious to everyone present, including the dozen other customers who turned to watch the exchange. Maria stopped mid-step, confusion flickering across her face. She looked at her husband, then at Bumpy, then back at her husband. "Vincent, we have tables. We're full," Marcello repeated, his voice firmer now, louder. "Perhaps the gentleman can find somewhere else to dine." The restaurant went completely silent now. The kind of silence that settles over a room when everyone knows they're witnessing something significant, something that will be talked about for years. Bumpy Johnson stood perfectly still, his face revealing nothing. No anger, no surprise, no emotion at all. He simply looked at Marcello with those calculating eyes that had been assessing threats and opportunities for over 3 decades. "I see," Bumpy said quietly. His voice was calm, conversational, the tone a professor might use when a student had given an incorrect answer. "You're certain you're full?" "Quite certain," Marcello replied. He was standing behind his cash register now, the heavy wooden counter between himself and Bumpy like a barrier. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable somewhere else." Bumpy nodded slowly, as if this made perfect sense. He looked around the restaurant, his gaze moving methodically from table to table, customer to customer, taking inventory of faces, memorizing details. Then he looked back at Marcello. "Have a pleasant evening," Bumpy said, and then he left. The moment the door closed behind him, conversation resumed in the restaurant, but it was different now, hushed, nervous. Maria Marcello approached her husband, her face pale. "Vincent, what did you just do?" "I ran my business," Marcello replied. "This is America. I serve who I want to serve."
But even as he said it, Marcello felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. He just made a decision that couldn't be unmade. taken a stand that would have consequences he couldn't yet imagine. What Marcelo didn't understand was that his rejection of Bumpy Johnson wasn't just personal, it was political. In Harlem's complex social ecosystem, respect wasn't just courtesy, it was currency. By publicly refusing service to Bumpy Johnson in front of a room full of witnesses, Marcelo had sent a message to the entire community. He was declaring himself outside the established order, above the unwritten rules that governed how business was conducted. Within 2 hours of Bumpy's departure, 3 things happened that Vincent Marcelo noticed. First, his regular evening customers began making excuses to leave. Second, his vegetable supplier called to inform him that tomorrow's delivery would be delayed indefinitely. Third, the jazz trio that played Thursday nights called to cancel their weekly engagement. By closing time that Monday night, Marcelo's restaurant was empty except for Maria and himself. They cleaned up in silence, counting the day's receipts, which were significantly lower than usual. Maria kept glancing at her husband, waiting for him to acknowledge what was happening, but Marcelo remained stubborn. "It'll blow over," he told his wife as they locked up. People have short memories. Tuesday morning proved him wrong. Marcelo arrived at his restaurant at 8 a.m. to find his usual morning deliveries hadn't arrived. The bread from Goldstein's Bakery, the coffee from Santos Brothers, the fresh pasta from DeMarco's, none of it came. When he called to inquire, he received polite explanations about delayed shipments and scheduling conflicts, but the message was clear. By noon, the word had spread through Harlem's business community with the efficiency of a telegraph system. Vincent Marcelo, the new Italian restaurant owner, had disrespected Bumpy Johnson, and in Harlem, disrespecting Bumpy Johnson meant disrespecting the community itself. The lunch crowd that Tuesday was sparse. The few customers who did enter seemed nervous, uncomfortable, glancing around as if they were doing something they shouldn't. By evening, when the dinner crowd should have been filling every table, Marcelo found himself serving maybe a dozen people in a restaurant designed for 60. Maria pleaded with her husband throughout the day. "Call him," she said. "Apologize. Explain that you made a mistake." But Vincent Marcelo was a proud man. He built his restaurant with his own hands, invested his life savings, worked 16-hour days to make his dream real. He wasn't about to bow down to what he saw as neighborhood intimidation. "This is America," he told his wife, repeating the phrase like a mantra. "I don't need anyone's permission to run my business." What Marcelo didn't understand was that power in Harlem didn't come from legal rights or business licenses. It came from relationships, from understanding that every action had community consequences, from recognizing that true authority was earned through service, not demanded through stubbornness. Tuesday evening, Vincent Marcelo was wiping down tables in his nearly empty restaurant when the door chime announced a customer. He looked up to see Bumpy Johnson entering for the second time in 2 days. This time, Bumpy wasn't alone. 2 men flanked him, both impeccably dressed, both carrying themselves with the quiet confidence of men who rarely needed to prove their authority. But what made Marcelo's blood freeze wasn't the presence of Bumpy's associates. It was the man who followed them through the door. Father Michael O'Sullivan, from St. Mark's Cathedral, an Irish priest who'd served the Harlem community for over 20 years. Behind him came Mrs. Dorothy Washington, who ran the neighborhood's largest grocery store. Then came Thomas Chen, who owned 3 laundromats along Lenox Avenue. One by one, Harlem's business leaders filed into Marcelo's restaurant, not customers, delegates, representatives of the community that Marcelo had thought he could ignore. Bumpy Johnson approached the same hostess station where he'd been turned away 24 hours early. Maria Marcelo was at the register, her face ashen. She looked at her husband, silently begging him to handle this differently than yesterday. "Good evening," Bumpy said, his voice carrying the same conversational tone as before. "I was hoping we might have that conversation about dinner." The restaurant was quiet except for the soft jazz playing from the radio behind the bar. Every eye in the room was focused on the exchange between the 2 men. This wasn't just about a restaurant reservation anymore. This was about how power worked, how communities functioned, how respect was earned and maintained.
Marcelo felt the weight of every gaze in the room. His chest was tight, his palms sweating. The business leaders of his own neighborhood stood behind Bumpy Johnson, their presence sending a message that couldn't be misunderstood. Vincent Marcelo could continue his stand on principle, or he could acknowledge that he'd misunderstood the rules of the game he'd chosen to play. "Mr. Johnson," Marcelo said, his voice barely above a whisper. We had a misunderstanding yesterday, did we?" Bumpy's tone remained neutral. "Curious. I thought your message was quite clear." Marcelo's legs felt weak. The pride that had sustained him for 24 hours was crumbling under the reality of his situation. He wasn't just facing the loss of his business. He was facing exile from the only community his restaurant could serve. "I made a mistake," Marcelo said, the words feeling like stones in his throat. "I didn't understand. I didn't realize." "What didn't you realize?" Bumpy asked. It wasn't mockery.
It was education. Bumpy Johnson was giving Vincent Marcello an opportunity to learn something that would serve him for the rest of his life. I didn't realize that this neighborhood, that it works differently than where I came from. Bumpy nodded slowly. And how does it work, Mr. Marcello? The question hung in the air. Every person in the restaurant waited for Marcello's answer, understanding that his response would determine not just his own future, but how the community would treat the dozen other new businesses that had opened along their stretch of Lenox Avenue in the past year. Marcello looked around the room, seeing the faces of the people he'd hoped to serve, the community he'd wanted to be part of. Father O'Sullivan offered a gentle nod of encouragement. Mrs. Washington's expression remained neutral, but not unkind. These weren't enemies. These were neighbors, trying to help him understand how to be a good neighbor in return. It works, Marcello said slowly, through respect, through understanding that we're all connected. And, Bumpy prompted. Marcello's voice dropped to barely audible. And I disrespected that connection. I disrespected you. I disrespected this community. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 10 seconds, but it felt eternal to Vincent Marcello. Then Bumpy Johnson smiled. Not a triumphant smile, not a mocking smile, but the warm expression of a teacher whose student had finally grasped a difficult concept. Mr. Marcello, Bumpy said, I would very much like to try your veal parmigiana, if you have it available this evening. Relief flooded through Marcello's body like a physical wave. Yes, sir. Absolutely. Right this way. As Bumpy was seated at the table by the window, the same table Maria had been leading him to the night before, something remarkable happened. The business leaders who had accompanied him didn't leave. They took tables throughout the restaurant. Father O'Sullivan ordered the chicken marsala. Mrs. Washington asked about the wine selection. Thomas Chen inquired about the pasta specials. Within 30 minutes, Marcello's restaurant was fuller than it had been since opening night. Word traveled through the neighborhood with the same efficiency that had emptied the place 24 hours earlier. Bumpy Johnson was dining at Marcello's. The restaurant was back in the community's good graces, but the evening's lesson wasn't over yet. As the night progressed, Bumpy conducted what could only be described as court. Business owners approached his table with questions about suppliers, disputes with landlords, problems with city inspectors. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would make headlines, just the quiet work of maintaining order in a complex community. Marcello watched from behind his register, beginning to understand the role that Bumpy Johnson actually played in Harlem. He wasn't a gangster holding the neighborhood hostage. He was an arbitrator, a problem solver, a man whose authority came not from intimidation, but from his ability to make things work for everyone. When the Italian bakery on 127th Street couldn't get a permit renewed, Bumpy made a phone call. When the police were hassling the jazz clubs for operating after midnight, Bumpy arranged a meeting. When new businesses like Marcello's opened without understanding the community dynamics, Bumpy provided education. Around 9:30 p.m., as the dinner crowd began to thin, Bumpy approached Marcello's cash register. The interaction that followed would define their relationship for years to come. Excellent meal, Bumpy said, pulling out a leather wallet. What do I owe you? Nothing, Marcello said quickly. Please, after yesterday, it's on the house.
Bumpy shook his head. Mr. Marcello, I pay for my meals. That's how business works. He placed exact payment for the meal on the counter, then added a generous tip. I'll be recommending your restaurant to my friends, he said. I hope you'll be able to accommodate them. Always, Marcello replied. Always welcome. Bumpy Johnson nodded and turned to leave. Then he paused and looked back at the restaurant owner. Mr. Marcello, he said quietly, Harlem takes care of its own. But first, you have to understand that you belong to Harlem, not the other way around. After Bumpy left, Vincent Marcello stood in his restaurant, looking around at the tables that had been full, the business that had been restored, the community that had welcomed him back. He understood now what he'd been too proud to see before. He hadn't just been refused delivery service and lost customers. He'd been taught a lesson about how community actually worked. The next morning, 3 things happened that confirmed Marcello's new understanding. His regular deliveries arrived on time. 2 new suppliers called to introduce themselves, offering better prices than his previous vendors. And Mrs. Washington stopped by to discuss catering her son's wedding reception. Vincent Marcello's restaurant became one of Harlem's most successful establishments. Not because the food was exceptional, though it was very good. Not because the prices were the lowest, though they were fair. But because Marcello had learned to see his business as part of something larger than himself. The story of Bumpy Johnson and Vincent Marcello spread through Harlem like folklore,
told and retold in barbershops and beauty salons, at church socials and block parties. But the story that people told wasn't about intimidation or power plays. It was about community, about understanding your place in something larger, about the difference between rights and relationship. Years later, when younger business owners faced similar moments of decision, older residents would tell them about the Italian restaurant owner who thought he could ignore the neighborhood's unwritten rules, and how the most powerful man in Harlem had taught him that true power comes not from the ability to exclude, but from the wisdom to understand when you belong to something bigger than yourself. Bumpy Johnson never threatened Vincent Marcello. He never demanded an apology or payment or submission. He simply demonstrated what community meant, what respect looked like, and how power actually worked in a place where relationships mattered more than legal rights. The lesson wasn't about fear. It was about understanding that in any community, your success is connected to everyone else's success. That respect isn't just politeness, it's the foundation that everything else is built on. And that sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do, is help someone understand how to belong. Vincent Marcello learned that lesson in 20. It shaped how he ran his business, how he treated his customers, how he understood his place in Harlem for the rest of his life. Not through intimidation, but through education. Not through force, but through the quiet demonstration of how community actually works when everyone understands their role. That's the kind of power that doesn't need to be announced or displayed. It simply is. And that's what made Bumpy Johnson more than just another figure in Harlem's history. He was the man who understood that true authority comes not from making people fear you, but from helping them understand how to be part of something larger than themselves.